Okay, strap yourselves in, because today we're going deep on those potential ripples from the Trump administration's policies.
Yo, you mean?
Yeah, like how they're tackling spending and those social safety nets.
Right, right.
You gave us like a whole grab bag of sources on this
Oh,
one.
yeah.
Yeah, we've got those big name think tanks, like Brookings,
Mm-hmm.
the Center for American Progress, and the Institute for Policy Studies.
All coming at it from their own angles.
Exactly. And then we're going to dig into some hard data, too, from the National Equity Atlas and Urban Institute.
Solid sources.
And to wrap it all up, we've got like a little peek into what Americans are thinking with some public opinion stuff from Pew Research Center.
So we're seeing how this all plays out in people's minds, huh?
Exactly. Trying to see how everyday folks are reacting to all of this.
It's always fascinating to see how all these sources, with their own little biases and ways of doing things, tackle these policies.
That's like we're putting together a puzzle, but all the pieces are from different boxes.
I like that.
But that's what makes this deep dive so interesting, right?
Totally.
Unpredictable.
We're going to try to piece it all together and see what picture we end up with.
Love it.
So, where do we even start with all of this?
Well, I think one of the most immediate and impactful things is that proposed spending freeze from the Trump administration.
Ah, yes, the spending freeze.
Yeah.
This is where things could get interesting.
To say the least.
Yeah, to say the least.
It's a big one.
The Center for American Progress, CAP, they have a report, and it really digs into what could happen.
Especially for those social safety nets, so many folks rely on those.
Right, those are crucial.
Absolutely. And it's not just about the cuts themselves, it's about what they represent.
What do you mean?
Well, CAP, they're actually saying this freeze could be illegal.
Whoa, hold on. Illegal?
That's what they're saying. They point to the Impoundment Control Act from way back in '74.
Oh, wow.
It basically limits the president's power to just withhold funds that Congress already approved.
So it's a power struggle then? Oh, absolutely. Executive branch versus legislative. And in the middle, you've got all these programs just hanging in the balance.
So it's not just about whether these programs are worth funding, it's about who gets to decide that.
Exactly. That's the core issue here.
That's a pretty big deal.
Huge. And then we have the Institute for Policy Studies, IPS, coming in with a completely different take.
Cool, really.
Yeah, they have this article, A Coup Attempt Against American Taxpayers.
Wow.
And they're basically saying this freeze isn't about saving money, it's about, undermining essential services.
So they see it as intentional.
Oh, yeah. They think it's all about shifting those resources to policies that benefit the wealthy.
So we've got CAP saying it could be illegal, and IPS calling it a coup.
Yeah, I'd say it's safe to call this spending freeze a little controversial.
Just a tad. But let's get specific. What programs are we talking about here? What could actually be impacted?
Well, CAP's report highlights a bunch. Childcare assistance is a big one.
Right, that makes sense.
School lunch programs, too.
Oh, wow. So kids are directly impacted.
And even rental assistance.
So families could literally lose their homes.
It's a real possibility, and these are programs that, millions of families rely on.
Yeah, it's not a small number.
And the cuts, they could be devastating, like a domino effect.
Domino effect, what do you mean?
Well, you cut childcare funding, parents can't afford to work, they lose income, then bam, food insecurity, and it just spirals.
Wow, yeah, I see what you mean.
It's interconnected, all of it.
That brings us to SNAP, right?
Oh, yeah, SNAP, or the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program.
The stamps.
Exactly.
It's one of those programs that you hear about, but it's easy to forget how many people actually depend on it.
Millions. Literally millions.
Wow.
And CAP, they have this article, How the Trump Administration Could Leave Families Hungry.
That title's pretty blunt.
No kidding. But it gets right to the point,
Yeah, for sure.
And to really understand this, we got to zoom out, look at the big picture.
Okay, zoom out. Let's do it.
The Urban Institute, they point out that even though we're one of the richest countries in the world, over 10% of Americans are living below the poverty line.
10%. That's a lot.
It is. And then imagine you add potential SNAP cuts on top of that.
Oh, man.
You're looking at a massive increase in food insecurity across the whole country.
So people are already struggling, and then you take away one of their lifelines.
Exactly. It's a double whammy. And that's why these proposed changes, the specifics, they matter so much.
Right. It's not just some abstract policy debate.
It's real families having to make impossible choices. Food, rent, keeping the lights on.
This isn't just about individual families struggling, though, right?
Oh, no. This kind of widespread food insecurity, it impacts whole communities.
How so?
Well, think about it. It affects kids, how they develop, their ability to learn, even their health long term.
Makes sense.
Adults have a harder time finding and keeping jobs, so the cycle of poverty continues.
Right, it's all connected.
And then local economies take a hit because people aren't spending as much.
Wow, the ripple effects are huge.
Massive. So we've got this proposed spending freeze that could impact, like, everything. Childcare, housing, food security for millions.
And we've got these totally different interpretations of what it all means, what the goal is.
Yeah, it's a lot to process.
It is, and we haven't even touched on taxes yet.
Oh, right, taxes. That's a whole other can of worms.
That's the other side of the coin, right?
Yeah.
Spending cuts take money out, but taxes determine where it goes or doesn't go.
You got it. And CAP, they've been analyzing the House Republicans' new tax package.
Yeah, what'd they find?
It looks like it could disproportionately benefit billionaires.
Over families.
You got it.
Wow.
And this ties in directly with that Institute for Policy Studies report, Executive Excess 2024.
What's that one about?
It's all about how some corporations seem to prioritize enriching CEOs and shareholders over, like, investing in their workers.
Or paying their fair share of taxes.
Exactly. So you could have programs for struggling families being cut, while corporations and the super rich are paying less in taxes.
It's like two different realities.
It really is, and that's where the National Equity Atlas comes in.
They focus on income inequality.
Right, that's their whole thing, and their data shows just how big the gap between the rich and poor has become.
It's like we're building a society where the rungs on the ladder are getting further and further apart.
Perfect analogy. And these policies, taken together, they could make that gap even wider.
Okay, so we've got the spending freeze, potential tax cuts, and this backdrop of income inequality.
It's all connected. You can't talk about one without the others.
A complex web, that's for sure.
And we can't ignore climate change either. It's all tied in.
Ugh, climate change. Yeah, that's a whole other layer.
It's a big one.
I think that's a conversation for part 2 of our deep dive, though.
Definitely, we'll need a whole section for that.
Stay tuned, everyone. We'll be back after a quick break. Okay, so we talked about that potential spending freeze, the potential tax cuts, and that whole income inequality thing.
It's a lot, right? Like, we're standing at the edge of this swirling vortex of policy changes.
And no idea which way it's going to spin.
It's complex, that's for sure. A lot of moving pieces.
But these policies, they don't exist in a vacuum, right?
No, absolutely not. They all interact, and they're happening against this backdrop of, well, the social and economic realities.
It's like trying to understand a single brushstroke without seeing the whole painting.
Exactly. You got to connect the dots, see how it all fits together.
So climate change.
Yeah.
I have to admit, when I was going through all the stuff for this deep dive, that Brookings piece on climate migration,
Oh, yeah.
yeah, it really, stopped me in my tracks.
It's a powerful one.
We hear about climate change all the time, but this article, it shows how it's already messing with people's lives.
It's not just theoretical anymore.
In very real ways.
Absolutely. And it's not just about, like, the sea levels rising or those crazy weather events.
Right, it's got to be bigger than that.
It's about the ripple effects, how climate change can make existing inequalities worse, and create whole new challenges for communities that are already struggling.
Okay, so break down this climate migration thing for me.
Sure. So it's basically people moving from one place to another because of climate change impacts.
So they're being forced out.
Yeah, it could be sea level rise, drought, those extreme weather events we talked about, or anything that makes it impossible to stay where they are.
So not just choosing to move to nicer weather, it's being forced out.
Exactly. And that kind of forced migration, it can be devastating for individuals, families, whole communities.
And that's where the Urban Institute's research on mobile homes comes in, right?
Oh, yeah. They found that those 1.2 million mobile homes in the U.S., they're super vulnerable to those climate extremes.
And a lot of those folks living in mobile homes are already, struggling financially.
Absolutely. So you've got this really vulnerable population that's going to be hit hardest by climate change.
Which is being driven by policy decisions.
Exactly. Like environmental regulations, investments in renewable energy, it's all connected.
Okay, so we've got climate change forcing people to move, potentially more displacement in the future. And then we've got those potential spending and tax changes that could make it even harder for those communities to deal with it.
It's a tough situation, no doubt.
It's starting to feel kind of bleak, to be honest.
It's challenging, but I think it's important to remember that we're not powerless.
What can we do? Where do we even start with all this?
Awareness is key. The more we understand about these issues, the better we can advocate for change.
Right. But it's easy to feel like one person can't do anything.
I get that, but change often starts small. at the grassroots level.
Okay.
The National Equity Atlas, they have this great quote: "Racial and economic inequality are the defining issues of our time."
Wow, that's powerful.
They're not shying away from the challenge, and neither should we.
It's like a call to action. We all have a role to play.
Exactly. And it brings us back to those different interpretations of these policies.
Mm-hmm.
Some people think economic growth will solve everything, like a rising tide lifts all boats.
Right, I've heard that one.
But others argue that we need a more focused approach, those social safety nets, investments in renewable energy, to really tackle the root causes.
It's like two different conversations happening at the same time.
And they're not connecting.
So how do we bridge that gap? Find solutions that work for everyone.
Well, it starts with listening, being willing to see things from someone else's perspective.
Okay, yeah, empathy.
The Pew Research Center's data on public opinion, that's really helpful here.
Oh yeah, we haven't even talked about that yet. What's Pew saying?
Well, one thing that jumped out at me is the decline in public trust in government.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Like there's this growing sense that the system is rigged.
It's easy to feel like your voice doesn't matter when you're up against, like, powerful interests and all that political gridlock.
Exactly. And that feeling makes it harder to have those constructive conversations, find common ground.
But Pew also found that people are, like, increasingly supporting action on climate change, right?
That's right. And they want policies that promote economic fairness.
So there's hope.
Even with all the pessimism and polarization, there are signs that people are waking up to these issues and demanding change.
And maybe that's where that generational shift comes in.
You think so?
Well, Pew found that the 119th Congress is younger, fewer boomers, more Gen Xers.
Interesting.
Could that change how they approach policymaking?
It's possible different generations have different values and priorities.
Right. Makes sense.
Gen Xers, for example, they grew up with rapid technological change and economic uncertainty.
So they're more used to things changing all the time.
They might be more attuned to the challenges facing working families and the need for policies that promote economic security.
It's like they understand that the world is always changing and we need to be flexible and innovative to keep up.
They might be more willing to challenge the status quo, embrace bolder solutions.
That's a cool way to think about it. And it reminds us that these policy debates are not just about numbers and statistics.
No, they're about people's lives, their hopes and fears, their dreams.
And if we forget that, we're kind of missing the point.
We risk making decisions that hurt the very people we're trying to help.
Okay, so we've got this complex web of climate change, income inequality, those social safety nets, and then these policy changes that could make things better or worse.
And a generational shift happening that could bring new ideas to the table. It's a lot to process.
It is. And it's not a one-time conversation, right?
No, it's an ongoing dialogue.
We have to keep talking about it with ourselves and with each other.
Stay informed, stay engaged, and keep pushing for the kind of world we want.
Okay, so where do we go from here? What questions should we be asking ourselves as we deal with all of this?
I think a big one is, how do we balance economic growth with social and environmental responsibility?
Can we have both?
That's the question, right? Or do we have to pick one?
It's a tough one. There's always this tension between those two goals.
And I think we need to acknowledge that tension, recognize that every policy decision has trade-offs.
And what about the role of government?
Oh, that's a big one.
What should they be doing to address these challenges?
Some people think the government should be more hands-on, regulating the economy, providing those safety nets.
Others want them to stay out of it.
Exactly. And there are so many different opinions on what the right balance is.
And those opinions are shaped by our own experiences, our values, our beliefs.
Absolutely. It's not just about finding the right answers. It's about having those conversations and trying to understand each other.
So it's about building empathy, really.
I think so. And those conversations, they're essential for building a better future.
So as we wrap up part 2 of our deep dive, what are some key takeaways you want to leave our listeners with?
Well, I think the main one is that these issues are all connected. You can't talk about one without the others.
It's all part of the same web.
And another important point is that we all have a role to play. We can't just wait for someone else to fix things.
We have to be part of the solution.
Stay informed, stay engaged, and keep pushing for change.
It's a call to action. We're not powerless. We can make a difference.
Exactly. We have agency, we have a voice, and we have a responsibility to use them.
Man, we've covered a lot in this deep dive.
Haven't we?
From that potential spending freeze and those tax cuts to climate change and that growing gap between the rich and poor.
Yeah, a lot of big challenges facing the country right now.
It's clear we've got some serious stuff to deal with.
And we've seen how those issues, they all connect, right?
It's like this giant web of cause and effect.
Yeah, hard to untangle sometimes.
And we've seen how differently people are interpreting these policy changes, too.
Oh, absolutely.
Some folks see them as the key to, like, economic success.
A rising tide lifts all boats, right?
But others are worried they'll just make inequality worse.
Make things even harder for those who are already struggling.
Exactly. And then you've got this generational shift happening in the background.
Younger folks bringing new ideas and priorities.
So where do we go from here? What does it all mean for, the people listening?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right.
And I think each of us has to answer that for ourselves.
Because these decisions, they affect all of us,
Really?
right?
One way or another, yeah.
It's easy to feel overwhelmed by all of this, but
Yeah.
we've got to remember, we're not powerless.
We're not just along for the ride.
We have a voice.
And we have to use it.
It's a reminder that even when things feel chaotic and uncertain, we still have choices.
We can make a difference.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And those choices, they start with understanding the issues,
Right.
having those tough conversations.
And fighting for the kind of world we want to see.
I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier about finding common ground.
Oh, yeah.
We're living in a time where everything feels so divided, so polarized.
It's hard to talk to each other, especially when we disagree.
So how do we bridge that gap?
It's a tough one, and honestly, I don't have all the answers.
But where do we even start?
I think it starts with remembering that we're all human, even when we disagree, even when we see the world differently.
Seeing each other as people, not just, like, political enemies.
Exactly. It's about listening to each other, trying to understand where the other person is coming from,
Being open to changing our minds.
and finding that common ground, even when it's hard.
And maybe, just maybe, that younger generation can help with this.
How so?
Well, Pew's research, it shows that Gen Xers and millennials, they tend to be more open-minded,
Less stuck in their ways.
less tied to those old ideologies.
Interesting.
Maybe it's because they grew up in a world that was constantly changing.
Makes sense.
They had to learn to adapt,
Be more flexible.
find solutions that work for everyone, not just their own group.
That's hopeful, isn't it?
It is. It reminds us that change is possible, even when things seem impossible.
We're not doomed.
So if you're listening to this and you're feeling that urgency, that
Yeah.
desire to do something to make a difference,
Where do you even begin?
stay informed. That's a big one.
Pay attention to what's happening in the world.
Read articles, listen to different perspectives.
Talk to people who disagree with you.
The more you understand, the better you can fight for change.
Knowledge is power, right?
And don't be afraid to talk to your elected officials.
Oh yeah, they work for you.
Let them know what you care about.
Civic engagement is crucial.
Voting, volunteering, speaking out, every little bit counts.
It all adds up.
And remember, you don't have to do it alone.
Find your people.
There are so many amazing organizations and people out there working to make the world a better place.
Find your tribe, connect with them, and build that movement for change.
The future isn't set in stone, right?
We get to create it.
Through our choices, our actions, our commitment to building something better.
And that's a powerful thing.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, one last thought.
Okay.
All those sources we looked at, they show this big tension
Between what?
between the folks who think these policies will help the economy as a whole
A rising tide, yeah.
and those who are worried they'll just make inequality worse.
Two very different perspectives.
Where do you stand in all of this? What role do you want to play in shaping the future? Those are the questions we want you to think about.
Yeah, keep those in mind as you follow all of this unfolding,
Thanks for joining us on this journey. We hope you learned something.
and that you feel empowered to make a difference.
That's what it's all about.
Yeah.